Are you looking for a new vintage watch, but are often unsure about the originality of the ads offered? Is the watch really original and unpolished as many sellers promise? Are missing Swiss-made stamps, oddly applied writings and letters, or inconsistent coloring a sign for a redial? In today's video, we share all the knowledge we've collected over the years to recognize a refinished vintage watch style. So I promise you that by the end of the video, you will feel much more confident before buying your next vintage watch. There are many things that can go wrong if one doesn't know what to look out for. Wrong dial, movements, crowns, hands, Frankenwatches, and so on. The vintage watch market is booming, and wherever there's a lot of money to be made, there's accordingly a lot of cheating and lying. Before we jump into the video, we would like to start with a little experiment. Take a look at these two vintage pieces. In the left hand, a blue-faced Rolex Oyster date from the 70s, and in the right hand, an Omega from the 50s with a so-called honeycomb dial. So we would like to know from you if these are original, untouched dials, or has someone already done some work here? We will now show you some close-ups of the two watches, and you try to pay attention to all the details that catch your eye. At the end of the video, we will answer you with all the points explained so far, whether both watches have been refinished, only one, or none of them. If you've seen several of our videos, you already know that we select our watches based on the 3 C's: condition, condition, and condition. Unfortunately, this sounds easier than it actually is, because it requires a lot of knowledge and experience. At the end of the video, my brother, who's in charge of buying our watches, reveals his personal top 3 of all points to recognize refinished dials. But I think I have rambled enough. Let's get to the point and start with how to recognize a refinished dial. With vintage watches or watches in general, the devil is in the details. So if you're considering an online ad, high resolution images are essential. Here you can see how we present, for example, a Patek Philippe ellipse on our website. High resolution pictures where you can see every detail. The condition of the dial, case, bracelet, clasp, and movement. Those pictures are essential for every online watch purchase. Without high quality images, it can be very difficult or even impossible to recognize a well-made redial. So if the seller does not provide high resolution images and close-ups upon request, don't bother. If you have the opportunity to inspect the watch in person, be sure to have a magnifying glass with minimum 10 times magnification, light and UV light in your pocket. There are several signs by which you can tell if the dial of an old watch has been touched. But before we list every single point here, we must distinguish between clear and unclear signs. Not everything that appears strange or odd on a vintage dial must be necessarily indicate a redial, because quality assurance in the 20th century was not nearly as high as it is today. Even at Patek Philippe, a brand known for its craftsmanship, you can find some models from the 40s and 50s with logo lettering that looks strange and inaccurate and is anything but precise. However, this does not mean that the dial has been manipulated and is not original, but more on that later. So let's begin with 5 clear signs for refinished dial: color, glue deposits, symmetry, texture, and lume. But first we have to understand how a vintage dial is constructed, because the construction can tell us a lot about the originality of the dial in retrospect. The construction of a vintage watch dial can vary depending on the manufacturer and era of production, but typically it consists of several layers of materials. Vintage dials always consist of a base plate, which is usually made of metal. On this plate, the paint or lac is applied in a second step, followed by printed or stamped letters, numbers and logos, and only then were protruding logos and indices, such as hour markers made of simple or precious metals, applied. So here comes the clear sign number 1, color. With that in mind, the first thing you should do is make sure that the dial color is really just on the dial. It was there before any logos, hour markers or anything else touched the dial. Look at the pictures or with a magnifying glass very carefully at the transitions between the dial and the applications. If you see any color on the hour markers, logos or every other application, it's 100% sign that the dial has been refinished. The second clear sign to look out for is glue deposits. So just look at this vintage Rolex Oyster Perpetual dial. Just take a few seconds to spot all details. Start at 12 o'clock, take a close look at the applied crown logo and the printed Oyster Perpetual lettering, and let your gaze wander clockwise across the dial. And did anything catch your eye? If not, turn your attention to the hour marker at 6 o'clock. It's so obvious that you almost don't notice it. It's upside down. That, of course, is a clear sign that the hour markers on this dial have already been tampered with. When a dial has been tampered with, such as applying new paint to the surface, a good restorer would have to remove all applications beforehand to ensure an even distribution of color. After the dial has dried, these are then reapplied using glue and pressed on, which often results in leftovers at the transitions to the dial. However, in the case of this Oyster Perpetual, we can say that the dial itself is in original condition, as can be seen by the well-preserved surface texture and the excellently preserved sunburst effect. But more on this in point 4. We assume that the 2 hour markers have come loose over the years and the repair was done on loan. The third clear sign for a refinished dial is symmetry. To judge and classify the symmetry of a vintage watch requires a lot of time, patience and a good eye. I don't know if you know this feeling when you look at the face of a vintage watch and something seems wrong to you. But at the same time, you can't say exactly what seems wrong to you. In most cases, this feeling is caused by an unbalanced dial layout. As described in the previous point, a good dial doctor removes all applications before starting his work. If he puts them back on after the work is done, they may not be fixed in their original position. To check this exactly, you should check that all hour markings have the same distance to each other and to the edge of the dial. You can also check whether applied lume plots have exactly the same position as the hour markers and what is the relationship to any applied outer scales. Also, watches that don't have numbers as hour markers are always aligned in the center of the dial. If you extend their axis, they should meet approximately, not necessarily exactly, in the middle of the dial. Paying attention to such small details sounds excessive at first, but it can make a big difference and save you from bad purchases and disappointment. The next point you have to consider is number 4, dial texture. Original vintage dials often have a subtle texture such as sunburst pattern or a matte finish. If the dial looks too smooth or lacks texture, it's worth taking a closer look. Just grab your magnifying glass and play with the dial in the light. Look at it from different angles and look for any irregularities. If you only have pictures of the watch, compare it to listed watches from reputable and trustworthy dealers. By the way, you should do this for each of the mentioned and following points. There's nothing better than comparing a watch for sale with other watches listed on the internet. But unfortunately, there are also many rare references where you will not find anything to compare. The fifth and last clear proof for a redial can be obtained by checking applied lume elements. Of course, only if present. With the help of fluorescent surfaces on dials, you can wonderfully check the originality of a vintage watch. Use a magnifying glass with UV light and illuminate the dial for a short moment. When radium is illuminated with UV, the lume slowly glows and only slowly disappears when the light source is removed. Tritium, on the other hand, pops up very quickly and disappears again quickly. Superluminova also pop up super fast, but keeps the glow for a longer time. With this info, you can only determine the lume of your watch with the help of UV light. Then check if the color of the hands and the hour markers match or if they differ in luminosity or color. Just look at the color of the hand of this Universion F Campo. We can clearly see that the hands shine much brighter and in a different tone than the numerals. In this case, the numerals have retained the original luminosity and the hands have been relumed. So if there are differences, this is a clear sign that this watch has been refinished. Either the hands have been replaced, the dial, or the luminous material is simply no longer in its original condition. We have now worked out 5 clear signs that tell you that you should definitely keep your hands off a purchase. The following 3 unclear signs should make you sit up and take notice, do some more research on the object of your desire, and don't immediately slam your credit card number into the laptop. The first unclear sign is inconsistencies in the printing or font. With the exception of a few unique hand-painted pieces, original dials are usually printed in a factory. The markings and numerals on the dial are usually applied using a process called pad printing. A metal plate with the desired design is inked and the ink is transferred to the dial by a silicone pad. This creates crisp, precise markings on the dial. As already mentioned, super high resolution images or a good magnifying glass are an absolute must-have. And redials are usually made by hand, which means they are much more prone to human error. For example, uneven, crooked lines or poor quality letters and fonts are more likely to be the result of a redial. But as mentioned in the beginning of the video, there is no black and white. Not all vintage watches have super sharp, uniform and consistent lettering. Again, it's worth comparing with other lettering found on the internet. One method we suggest is to compare the printed numerals and letters on the dial. On many dials, like on this vintage Pro router, the numerals and letters are usually printed in the same font and shape. If we take a closer look at the printing of these dials, we see that all the letters in the respective row are completely identical. The first N looks exactly like the second N. The E's are identical, and in the second row, completely identical R's. Of course, the same is true for numbers that are found in a high number on, for example, chronographs. And these fine details are not achievable by the raw eye. But if you are still unsure, always leave the fingers from the purchase. Unclear sign number 2 is the lack of patina. Dials of old watches often develop a patina over time due to various factors such as sun exposure, which gives them a unique and attractive appearance. This ranges from the dial color to the hour markers up to the hands. If the watch is several decades old but still looks like it has been made from scratch, the dial appears too clean and has no patina, this may be a sign that the watch has only been in a box in the safe or that it has been tampered with. So ask yourself, does everything fit together on the watch? If the dial looks like it left the factory yesterday, but the movement looks like it's been dipped in one river or another, then something isn't quite right. Now we have arrived at the third and last uncertain sign of a redial. Missing Swiss-made term at the bottom of the dial. Imagine you've fallen completely in love with a vintage timepiece, but upon close inspection of the dial, you set in it to discover that the Swiss-made marker at 6 o'clock is missing. But is that automatically a sign of a redial? This question is hotly debated in many online forums. As with so many controversial topics in the world of vintage watches, there is no clear answer to this question. The fact is that if you see Swiss vintage watches, like for example this vintage Omega from the 1940s, without the Swiss-made marking, in most cases it means that the dial has been refinished, as it was very difficult to reprint it on the concave edge of the dial. However, this is not always the case. It is clear that in the 1930s and 40s, many original watches do not have a Swiss or Swiss-made mark. And in the 1950s, there are also a handful of references that lack the mark on original dials. In practice, it is the best to be careful of watches produced from the 1950s up to the 1970s with a dial that does not have the mark. But it shouldn't be a complete deal breaker. In this case, you should focus primarily on comparison with identical references. If all the others have the sought-after Swiss mark, you can be sure that your dial is a redial. However, as mentioned earlier, there are more effective methods of determining originality than checking Swiss-made, which require you to do some serious homework. but you've already done most of that homework by watching this video. What you need to do now is gain experience, because you can't get experience by watching videos or reading. You have to get it yourself. We have also eaten shit once or twice, but the good thing, on the other hand, is that these mistakes never happens a second time. To conclude the video, as promised in the intro, I would like to tell you the 3 golden rules of my brother Mark. He's responsible for purchasing our watches and spends most of his time at watch fairs. Of course, there's a huge selection there and he can get relatively good prices. But the downside is that he has very little time to make his buying decisions. He can't Google his way through the reference jungle and compare watches to originals. He has to rely on his knowledge, experience and gut feeling. He has tried to break this gut feeling down into 3 points: experience, condition and source. So the golden rule number 1 is experience. If he is unsure about a watch, he doesn't buy it, no matter how good the condition or how tempting the price offered. If he catches himself thinking about whether the watch is a Redial, he puts it aside immediately. Golden rule number 2 is condition. He pays special attention to the condition of the case and the movement. If both are in very good condition, there's a little chance that the dial has been refinished or replaced. Finally, golden rule is number 3, the source. Many people can't hear it anymore, but it is still the most important phrase to remember when buying a watch. Buy the seller, not the watch. Mark only buys from dealers and collectors that we trust, and with one we have established a long-standing business relationship. This has a great advantage that if it turns out afterward that the purchased watch is not original, has been refinished, or parts of the watch have been replaced, we can simply return it. Unfortunately, we have reached the end of the video. In summary, these 8 points are a good red thread that can make your next decision to buy or not to buy a little easier. So as promised at the start of this video, here's the solution to our experiment with the Rolex Oyster Date and the Omega Honeycomb. One of them is clear, a Redial, the other one is certainly debatable, but in our opinion, it too is a very well done Redial. So let's start with the Oyster Date, which clearly has a refinished dial that can only be seen with the help of a magnifying glass. When viewed with the naked eye, the only thing that stands out to us is the color of the dial, because we haven't seen this shade of blue like this before. But the patina that develops over the years can produce the most unusual colors, though nothing unusual here either. However, if we take a closer look at the dial structure and the printed lettering under the magnifying glass, it becomes clear. The lettering was applied by hand. Each letter looks different, which is a no-go for a Rolex from the 70s. This is also true for the precision imprint. Also, the entire surface of the dial is pimply glossy and not smooth and even as it should be. Here, the blue color and the Rolex lettering have clearly been repainted. The Omega with a honeycomb dial was sold to us as original, and we are sure that 90% of those who have this watch in their hands would confirm this. We also did not notice at first glance that some things do not match. Here again, the already mentioned and unlearnable gut feeling comes into the game. First of all, it must be said that all visible parts such as case, crown, movement, hour markers, hands and also the Omega logo are original and fit at the time. The only thing that doesn't fit is the second hand, which is clearly too long and extends beyond the applied cross. But a replaced second hand doesn't mean that the dial is refinished. What makes us wonder is the condition and shape of the honeycomb dial. We have had several honeycomb dials in our hands and never has such an old watch had such a clean dial without any patina. Moreover, the honeycomb structure is different from any Omega we have seen before. Normally, it looks like many small pyramids side by side with a greater depth. This dial looks more like a series of flat squares. In our opinion, it is a very well and professionally made Redial with crisply stamped lettering and skills. Pay attention to the color, glue deposits, symmetry, surface texture, lume, missing patina and lack of prints. There are a few more points by which you can recognize a Redial, but we think you are more than well advised with our selection. If I left out an important point, please let us know in the comments. So have a great day and hope to see you in our next video.